On a nightly basis, Tucker Carlson provides more evidence for why the right wing and the right-wing populists do not, in fact, mesh well with left-wing populists. They might see similar problems in society, but they have very different solutions and see the world from a very different framework. When it comes to the war in Afghanistan and what went wrong, notice how Tucker Carlson has decided to latch onto identity politics as opposed to focusing on the profit motives and the financial incentives of engaging in that war in the first place. Let's watch.
Over the past 20 years, for example, Congress has allocated close to $1 billion to export academic feminism to Afghanistan. Where'd that money go? Well, it went to programs like a 2-year master's degree in gender and women's studies offered at Kabul University, something Afghans apparently never knew they needed. Another US government effort, meanwhile, funded, quote, activities that educate and engage Afghan men and boys to challenge gender stereotypes. Right, they weren't doing that enough. And of course, always and everywhere, our leaders enforced the most American of all cultural exports, affirmative action. American-funded gender advisors demanded that women comprise at least 10% of the Afghan National Army and a still larger proportion of that country's political leadership. Thanks to American-imposed gender quotas, dozens of women ultimately were installed as representatives in Afghan's parliament. How'd that work? Well, the whole thing was a sham, as always. In fact, many of these new female legislators had never been to the provinces they claimed to represent. Almost nobody in Afghanistan liked any of this, by the way, and why would they? As one USAID official conceded in a classified report, quote, focusing on gender made things more unstable because it caused revolts. It caused revolts. But officials kept doing it. They kept pushing radical gender politics anyway because they could, because they were in charge of these Stone Age people they were going to educate.
So I love that he cited an official, not by name, didn't actually provide a direct quote, but just said, no, this is what happened. I mean, these gender and identity politics related stuff, like that's what led to the failure of our efforts in Afghanistan. It led to revolts. Okay, we spent over $2 trillion fighting the war in Afghanistan, a giant waste of money. So even if I were to believe Tucker Carlson, and I don't, that the $1 billion was spent on gender equality issues in Afghanistan, that is a drop in the bucket compared to the $2 trillion we spent on that failed war. Now, why did that war fail? I would argue that it has much less to do with identity politics and far more to do with the fact that the American people were lied to about why we were in Afghanistan in the first place. It was not to nation build, it was not to spread democracy, it wasn't even really to prop up a government. It was about enriching defense contractors specifically. And I have evidence of that. I'll get to it in just a minute, but Cenk, first you.
There's so many amazing things in that clip. When he says they wanted Afghan men to challenge gender stereotypes. Well, what does that mean? That means the stereotypes, unfortunately, in that fundamentalist culture of the Taliban is that women have no place in work, in government, with any power, any responsibility, and that men should dominate them and control their lives completely, and women should have no freedom. Wouldn't you want to challenge that stereotype? Wouldn't any decent person want to challenge that stereotype? Now, if you say, hey, look, the Afghans didn't challenge it enough, yeah, that's why they were trying to change the culture, because you weren't going to win a military war. We just proved that for 20 years of military occupation, didn't do a damn thing. Like, maybe education could have made a difference, but Tucker's reaction to that was, weren't they doing that enough? You think the Taliban were challenging gender stereotypes enough? Like, they nailed it on gender stereotypes? That was a startling thing to say. I didn't want to let it slide without you noticing that he said that.
I mean, look, I feel that challenging gender stereotypes is decapitating women if they're not wearing face coverings. And head coverings,
well,
right? That's challenging female stereotypes and inequality among the genders. Well, I mean, come on, just garbage, absolute garbage. Sorry, go ahead.
That's okay. And then the second part that he said is he talked about the women in government and how that didn't work. And he said, and then he concluded that. You can go back and watch the tape. And he said about the Afghans, why would they? Why would they want the women in government? You're actually saying that on television, out loud, in public. Right?
Yeah.
And And the audience cheers. He's #1 on Fox News. They're like, yes, if women, we could just subjugate them like the Taliban and never question any of those gender stereotypes and drive them back into the kitchen, etc. And then have the women in government. Of course they didn't like that. Who would? Why would they like women actually having power? And by the way, if you're a woman, you're still voting for Republicans. I mean, you just saw it. And he's not alone. Boebert celebrating and so many others celebrating the Taliban. And then ironically, Tucker, at a different portion of the same show, says, I don't want those refugees here. But actually, maybe it's not ironic. Because remember, the refugees were our allies in Afghanistan fighting against the Taliban. Maybe Tucker's mad at him for fighting against these beloved Taliban.
Look, the reason why I want to talk about this is because anyone who's stupid, and yes, stupid is the right word, to believe that we can join forces with so-called right-wing populists like Tucker Carlson to get what we want in our agenda accomplished in this country, like these people need to be cast aside as absolute lunatics, because clearly Tucker Carlson and people like him do not in any way share left-wing objectives. Okay, or any of the objectives that we have as progressives, leftists, anyone who's not on the far right. He doesn't want Medicare for all. He doesn't have a problem with US imperialism, especially if it enriches wealthy people, such as himself, by the way. Okay, he has a problem with the identity politics related to this story, which is nothing. That's not even a big part of this story. Big part of this story, and much of the other involvement that we have abroad in various countries, has to do with the profit motive. And he has no problem with that. He didn't mention the profit motive. He very briefly mentioned defense contractors, but he did it in the context of gender equality curriculum being funded. No. The defense contractors are being funded heavily by our money to carry out trainings of the very people who, by the way, turned around and joined the Taliban recently, right? The Afghan military, in the form of weaponry. Let me give you a few examples. The Intercept had a wonderful piece recently. This is the title of it. $10,000 invested in defense stocks when Afghanistan war began, now worth almost $100,000. And why is that? Why are these military contractors, defense contractors doing so well? Well, if you purchase $10,000 of stock evenly divided among America's top 5 defense contractors on September 18th, 2001, and faithfully reinvested all dividends, it would now be worth $97,295. This is a far greater return than was available in the overall stock market over the same period. $10,000 invested in an S&P 500 index fund on September 18th of 2001 would now be worth $61,613. These defense contractors outperformed the stock market because they kept getting one government contract after the next. That's money. Government grants, government money, government deals to carry out the war, the failed war in Afghanistan. No mention of that by Tucker Carlson, so-called populist. Glenn Greenwald alleges he's a freaking socialist. No, he's a clown. He's an absolute clown, and there's no way that aligning ourselves with the likes of Tucker Carlson or anyone like him is actually gonna help us accomplish any of the objectives on the left.
So look, important distinction here. If we got a ballot measure for $15 minimum wage or Medicare for all, etc., do we want Republican voters to vote for it? Yes, we do, right? And will we take their vote? Of course we will, because those are good policies and we want them to pass. They want to get out of wars, great. We're happy to have their votes, okay? But if you think going on Tucker Carlson and validating his talking points is a good idea, you have no idea what you're doing other than, of course, self-aggrandizement. Oh my God, I got famous by going on Tucker. Oh, I'm gonna get more Substackers. I'm gonna get more Patreon followers. Oh, they're gonna be right wing. Oh, I'm gonna be so happy. That's what you're doing, admitted. But look at this. You think he's against defense contractors? Look at what the point Anna's making. He throws it in there so he has plausible deniability as a one line, right? But then he tells you that we didn't lose the war because the Pentagon screwed up. 20 years total waste. We didn't lose the war because the defense contractors didn't do a goddamn thing except rob us of trillions of dollars. We lost the war because we were trying to treat women equally. That's why we lost the war?
It's insane.
Come on, and you're gonna go enable that?
Oh, yeah, Tucker, you're so right. I'm a jack-off comedian, but I know you're right. You're right about everything, Tucker.
You loser, you pathetic person trying to enable right-wing fascists. And by the way, you ever see so-called progressives or people on the left go on Tucker and ever disagree with them? Tucker's asked me on before. I said, well, I would disagree with you whenever we disagree. So, oh, no, that's it. And he never had me on. So these guys that pretend to be on the left, they go kiss his ass and they go, oh, I'll never disagree. I promise you, Tucker, get me some ratings, get me some followers, and I'll never disagree with you. Oh yeah, and by the way, that clown ass Jimmy went on his show and was like, oh no, yeah, you're right. The problem is the left wing playing identity politics. Go ahead, bash people's identities, Tucker. You're so good, you're so wonderful, Tucker. Let me pucker for Tucker. Okay,
yeah.
So, and that's exactly what those clowns do. Don't ever listen to them. Don't enable fascists like Tucker Carlson who cheerlead for the Taliban and their destruction of women's rights and women themselves. The guy's disgusting, and any rational person would see that. Thanks for watching The Young Turks, really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.